Ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, you've now heard from a number of different witnesses and had the opportunity to examine their evidence. We come to our final two witnesses and the accounts of their interaction with, alleged interaction with Mr. Jesus Josephson following his recovery from his alleged recovery from execution. You'll remember we spoke of the women and especially of Mary Magdalena, and you'll be hearing the evidence of Clopas and his companion. You also had personal testimony from a very high-ranking member of the Senate last week, and I shall be calling a separate session in order to discuss their evidence in more legal terms for your graces. But today we do need to press on, as time is very short before your graces will be required to make a decision in this case. Today we have to consider the evidence of a Mr. Thomas Didymus. Didymus apparently is his preferred surname, which refers to him as being a twin. Thomas Twinny, I believe you might call it if they were using an ordinary language rather than this rather barbaric version of Greek, which they seem to mix together with Aramaic, which is the language that they apparently speak from day to day. Thomas Didymus, Mr. Didymus, is one of the 12 who accompanied Mr. Jesus Josephson on his campaign of ministry, and he was one of those who fled the scene when Mr. Josephson was arrested. Now, it would appear that not all of the followers of Mr. Josephson gathered together at the same time. Mr. Didymus's report appears to suggest that whilst the others had gathered in the upper room, we are still trying to locate this particular place in Jerusalem. There are, of course, many upper rooms, so it's very difficult to point to a particular one and say this is the one. People have tried, but I really don't believe, your graces, it matters exactly where this room was. But the disciples were there, and they were still frightened. You will remember, your graces, that the women were frightened and told nobody. It would appear that the apostles of Mr. Jesus Josephson were frightened, even with the reports that he had risen from the dead from the women, even with Simon, son of Jonas, and John, son of Zebedee, even with their reports of having seen the tomb empty, Mrs. Magdalena's reports of actually having seen Mr. Josephson in the flesh, and indeed the reports from Clopas and his companion to the same. Despite this, they are still meeting in fear. They are fearful of the Jewish authorities and what the Jewish authorities will persuade Procurator Pontius Pilate to do to them. So apparently the doors were locked, and Mr. Josephson was suddenly in the room. We have absolutely no description of how Mr. Josephson entered the room, whether there was a spare key, whether he came in through the window or the roof, which apparently is a preferred means of entry for followers of Mr. Josephson. But we do not know how he came to be in this. Sorry, Your Graces, I do apologise. How it is alleged that he came to be in the room. Thank you to my colleague for reminding me with that very helpfully timed cough. How it is alleged that Mr. Josephson was in the room. I do apologise, Your Graces. This evidence does tend to cause one to speak in ways that are less than professional, and I do apologise. The alleged entry of Mr. Joseph into the room. However, Mr. Didymus, Thomas Didymus, is not present on this occasion. Again, it seems very strange that the disciples of Mr. Jesus Josephson are so keen to present themselves as a completely disorganised bunch of layabouts who can't even organise a decent conspiracy theory. I mean, your graces, given the ease with which conspiracies are portrayed amongst the populace of Rome, one cannot believe it is beyond the wit of man to organise a decent conspiracy, although it does seem to be beyond the wit of the followers of Mr. Josephson, because their testimony is absolutely absurd. Mr. Didymus wasn't present. So when he arrives some hours later, after Mr. Josephson has, Mr. Josephson left the building that he allegedly entered into, and Mr. Didymus is like, I shall not believe, I shall not believe, I shall not believe. And this is then the really rather distressing nature of his comments. You will recall that Mr. Josephson was crucified, which involves nails going through the wrists and also through the feet. You will also remember from the executioner's report that Mr. Josephson was thought to be dead rather too quickly, so they put a spear into his side, and it confirmed that Mr. Josephson was indeed dead. Mr. Didymus, at the point of having been told that Mr. Josephson was alive again, said, I will not believe it unless I put my fingers into the nail marks and place my hand in his side. Now, your graces, many of you are particular sticklers for evidence, and you particularly give weight to physical evidence. But I have to say, Mr. Didymus appears to be setting rather a high bar for his believing of the evidence of Mr. Josephson's resurrection. Alleged. Thank you, colleague. Resurrection. He wishes to place his finger into the nail marks, which is quite extraordinary, as you can imagine. And so then, your graces, a week passes and nothing happens. Well, at that point, I have to say, if I was one of the followers of Mr. Josephson, I'd be wondering whether I'd been part of a mass delusion. Mr. Didymus was clearly not willing to be convinced that Jesus Josephson had risen from the dead. The following Sunday, so a whole week after these curious events, the whole of the events that you've examined so far all happened on the Ides of Aprilis, and the events that I'm about to describe happen a whole 7 days later. Mr. Josephson has left for 7 days. The Lord alone knows what he was doing in that time. Allegedly doing in that time. Thank you, my esteemed colleague, for your reminders of proper legal protocol. So, the following Sunday, Mr. Didymus alleges that they were again gathered in the upper room, and then allegedly Mr. Josephson appeared and invited Mr. Didymus to poke his fingers through the now healed but open nail marks and to place his hand into Mr. Josephson's side. Quite a remarkable statement to make. But then, your graces, something equally remarkable happens. Mr. Didymus, who has been known amongst some of Mr. Josephson's followers as Doubting Thomas. What a wonderful name. It's called Doubting Thomas. Then kneels allegedly before Mr. Jesus Josephson and says, my Lord and my God. Your Graces, I have to remind you that unlike your Grace's most esteemed religion, where there are many gods who vie for your affection and favour, and you do the same, in the rather barbaric religion of Palestine, the Jewish faith contends that there is only one God, and that God is beyond and above humanity. So for Mr. Didymus to call Mr. Josephson God does seem to depart from Jewish teaching and mean that the new sect of followers of the allegedly resurrected Mr. Josephson will alienate vast quantities of the Jewish people who will not accept that a carpenter from Nazareth could possibly be God made incarnate in the world. Mr. Didymus's account is fantastical. It is not an account designed to garner more followers. Indeed, Your Graces, it is not an account designed to increase the likelihood of people choosing to follow the allegedly reborn Mr. Jesus Josephson. And yet, more and more and more people appear to be convinced that Mr. Josephson has risen from the dead. Your Graces, we estimate that from a small number of men and women present at Mr. Josephson's last supper with his friends before his arrest, his trial, his crucifixion, and his alleged resurrection, there may have been a few dozen followers. By this stage, we've already accounted for at least 150 of the followers of Mr. Josephson, and there are some suggestions that that number may increase as there are many people around the edges, up to 500 people who are expressing an interest in following the allegedly resurrected Mr. Josephson. This is quite remarkable. Someone who expressed such firm and vivid doubts of the resurrection of Mr. Josephson is suddenly convinced by what he claims to be entirely physical evidence of the said resurrection. And even more, he then makes a claim over Mr. Josephson that would alienate them from the rest of the Jewish community. I have to say, Your Graces, again, as I've said on many previous occasions, if these gentlemen were attempting a conspiracy to suggest that Mr. Josephson had risen from the dead, it would not have been hard to have written a more convincing account. The current accounts are absolutely preposterous, and certainly do not place Mr. Josephson's followers in a good light whatsoever. So, Your Graces, I leave you to continue to consider whether these witnesses are reliable. I can see presently three options before Your Graces, that these are unreliable witnesses, that they are falsifying their accounts, that they are deluded in their accounts of Mr. Josephson's alleged resurrection. And there is only one other possibility, which is too bizarre to contemplate, which is that Mr. Josephson actually rose from the dead. Either they're insane or evil, or they actually genuinely believe that Mr. Josephson rose from the dead because it's actually true. Your Graces, all I can do is invite you to look at the remainder of the evidence before you too make up your minds about the events of the Ides of Aprilis in Jerusalem. This court shall rise!